Hello, I'm going to tell this story in third person so it doesn't hurt so much inside. Karen had a smile that could charm even the most skeptical hearts, and Mark, her husband, had fallen for it 17 years ago. Their marriage was the envy of many in their tight-knit suburban community. Friends marveled at how they seemed to complement each other, her effervescent personality balanced by his quiet resilience. But behind the closed doors of their pristine home, shadows danced in corners no one dared to explore. Karen wasn't unhappy, or at least, that's what she told herself when she first met Daniel. It started innocently enough, a chance meeting at a conference she attended for her job in real estate. He was a consultant, tall and charismatic, with a sharp wit that disarmed her defenses. A shared laugh over Karen had a smile that could charm even the most skeptical hearts, and Mark, her husband, had fallen for it 17 years ago. Their marriage was the envy of many in their tight-knit suburban community. Friends marveled at how they seemed to complement each other, her effervescent personality balanced by his quiet resilience. But behind the closed doors of their pristine home, shadows danced in corners no one dared to explore. Karen wasn't unhappy, or at least, that's what she told herself when she first met Daniel. It started innocently enough, a chance meeting at a conference she attended for her job in real estate. He was a consultant, tall and charismatic, with a sharp wit that disarmed her defenses. A shared laugh over a spilled coffee turned into an exchange of numbers. For business, she'd assured herself. But business didn't explain the thrill she felt when his messages popped up on her phone or the hours they spent talking about everything and nothing. Karen told herself it wasn't cheating. After all, she never crossed the line. Not until 6 months later, when an after-hours meeting at a downtown hotel became something else entirely. Mark never suspected. He was too busy with his work at the local hospital, where he often picked up extra shifts to ensure their life was as comfortable as Karen had always dreamed. Their 2 daughters adored their father, and Karen played the part of a devoted wife and mother flawlessly. What Karen didn't expect was how long the affair would last. 17 years passed in a whirlwind of stolen moments, covert texts, and carefully constructed alibis. But no affair remains buried forever. The first crack appeared when Mark found an unfamiliar receipt in her handbag, an expensive dinner for 2 at a restaurant he'd never been to. Karen's explanation was seamless, a story so plausible that it left no room for suspicion. Yet, for Mark, something felt off. And then, there was the letter. A single envelope slipped under their front door one crisp autumn morning. The words inside would unravel the first thread of a life Karen thought she had carefully stitched together. The letter was typed on plain white paper, its contents concise, direct, and devastating. Mark, your wife isn't who you think she is. Ask her about Daniel. Ask her about her trips to New York. You deserve to know the truth. A friend. Mark's hands trembled as he read the note, the words piercing through the shield of trust he had always worn when it came to Karen. He reread it several times, the name, Daniel, sparking no immediate recognition. He couldn't recall a Daniel in their circle of friends or Karen's workplace. Then his eyes fell on the part about New York. Karen had gone to New York several times over the years for work conferences. He had never thought twice about it. Why would he? The idea seemed absurd at first. Karen had always been attentive, thoughtful, and loving. But as the day went on, the letter refused to leave his mind. He became hyper-aware of small inconsistencies. The way Karen's smile faltered when he brought up her upcoming trip, the late-night texts she claimed were from her coworkers, the new necklace she wore but never explained. Mark told himself it was probably a prank. Someone trying to stir up trouble. Yet, when Karen came home that evening, he couldn't help but watch her with fresh eyes. She greeted him with her usual warmth, kissed his cheek, and asked about his day. For the first time, he didn't respond with ease. He studied her, noticing the way she avoided direct eye contact as she set her purse down. Did she always do that? The letter remained hidden in his office drawer, but its weight grew heavier with each passing moment. Later that night, Mark found himself standing in the kitchen, clutching his phone. He wanted to call anyone, but who could he talk to about something like this? It felt ridiculous, almost paranoid. But before he could stop himself, he did something he'd never done in all their years of marriage. He scrolled through Karen's phone, which she'd left charging on the counter. Her messages seemed normal at first, filled with mundane exchanges with friends and colleagues. But then he saw a thread marked only by an initial, D. The messages were sparse, but there was one from just 2 days ago that made his blood run cold. D. Counting the days until I see you again. I can still feel your touch from last time. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. His grip tightened on the phone as he fought to breathe. This wasn't some baseless accusation. This was confirmation. But now, the question wasn't just whether Karen was cheating. The question was, who the hell was Daniel, and how long had this been going on? Mark stared at the screen, the message glowing like a portal to another reality he had never imagined. He knew confronting her now would yield no answers. He needed to play his hand carefully. And so, instead of exploding in rage or despair, Mark slipped the phone back where he found it and made a quiet decision. He would find out everything. Mark barely slept that night, lying in the dark with his thoughts racing like a storm. He replayed every moment, every trip Karen had taken, every time she had been late coming home, searching for clues he might have missed. The truth was, he had never looked for them before. He had trusted her implicitly. By morning, he had decided what he would do next. He wouldn't confront Karen yet. If she was hiding something, she would lie. Instead, he needed proof, irrefutable evidence that would leave no room for denial. The first step was to dig deeper into the mysterious D. Mark began with her phone records. He logged into their shared cell phone account and scanned the call logs. Karen had a habit of deleting texts, but call records were harder to erase. It didn't take long for him to find a recurring number, one that appeared with alarming frequency, often at odd hours. It was unlisted, but Mark noted it down anyway. Then there were her trips. Mark remembered how Karen had been particularly enthusiastic about a conference in New York 2 years ago. She had come back glowing, gushing about the city, the food, the experience. It hadn't seemed unusual at the time. Now, in hindsight, her excitement took on a different light. He went to her closet and found her luggage, rifling through the pockets in search of anything she might have missed. In the smallest pocket of her carry-on, he found a receipt. It was dated 3 years ago, from a hotel in New York. The name on the bill wasn't Karen's, it was Daniel's. Mark sat down heavily on the bed, staring at the receipt. His hands were shaking, and a lump formed in his throat. 3 years. If this receipt was any indication, the affair had been going on for at least that long. And if the letter was right, it might stretch back even further. He didn't know whether to feel betrayed, angry, or simply numb. Part of him wanted to tear into Karen, to demand the truth right then and there. But another part of him, a calmer, colder part, reminded him that he needed more than this. A receipt and a few texts wouldn't give him the answers he craved. He decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, invasive even, but he needed the full picture. If Karen had been living a double life, he deserved to know the extent of her betrayal. The next few days were agonizing. Karen carried on as if nothing had changed, while Mark struggled to maintain his composure. Every time she laughed or kissed him goodnight, it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He wanted to scream, to tell her he knew, but he kept his silence. The private investigator called him after a week. "I've got something," the man said, his voice steady. "You're going to want to see this." When Mark met the Mark couldn't stop staring at the photographs. Each image felt like a dagger, slicing through the years of trust he had so willingly given to Karen. 5 years ago. That meant she had been with this man, Daniel, for longer than he had suspected. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still missing something, a piece of the puzzle that made everything click. When he got home that evening, Karen was in the kitchen, humming as she chopped vegetables. The sight of her so carefree made Mark's stomach churn. He had seen her with Daniel. The way she looked at him in the photos was so alive. Her eyes sparkled in a way he hadn't seen in years. Had she ever looked at him like that? Over dinner, Mark decided to press gently, testing the waters. "You know," he began, keeping his tone light, "I was thinking about that trip you took to New York a few years ago. You loved it there, didn't you?" Karen froze for a fraction of a second, her hand pausing over her wine glass. It was subtle, but Mark caught it. She recovered quickly, laughing. "Oh, yes. It was wonderful. I remember the city had this incredible energy. Did you ever think about going back?" he asked, watching her closely. She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Maybe someday. Work doesn't really take me there anymore." Mark nodded, saying nothing more, but her reaction confirmed what he already suspected. She was lying. Later that night, as Karen showered, Mark sat in their bedroom, staring at the photos again. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't stop comparing the man in the images to himself. Daniel was taller, broader, with a confident swagger that practically radiated from the pictures. Mark, on the other hand, had always been more reserved. Practical. A man who prided himself on stability rather than flash. He thought back to something Karen had said years ago, during an argument they'd had in the early days of their marriage. It had been about something trivial, but her words had cut deeper than she realized. "You don't understand what it's like, Mark," she had said, her voice sharp with frustration. "To feel like something's missing, like you're settling for less than you need." At the time, he had dismissed it as heat-of-the-moment exaggeration. But now, those words echoed in his mind, taking on a new and painful significance. Was that what this was about? Had he always fallen short of what Karen truly wanted? It wasn't just about Daniel's charm, or his physique. It was about what Daniel symbolized: fulfillment, excitement, satisfaction. Things Mark had always tried to provide but feared deep down that he never quite could. The investigator had mentioned that Karen and Daniel's meetings were always discreet, always planned well in advance. They weren't casual encounters, they were something more. Karen wasn't just cheating, she was searching for something Mark hadn't been able to give her. The thought gutted him. He remembered the subtle comments she had made over the years, the way she sometimes avoided certain intimate conversations, or how she'd brush off his attempts to initiate closeness with an apologetic smile. He had thought they were happy. He had thought she was happy. But now he wondered if, all along, she had been quietly resenting him for not being enough. For the first time, Mark felt not just anger but shame. A suffocating sense that Karen's betrayal wasn't just about her choices, but about his inadequacies. It was a feeling he couldn't name, but it buried itself deep in his chest, threatening to crush him. The next morning, Mark woke to find Karen already gone, a note on the counter saying she'd left early for a work meeting. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he sipped his coffee, staring blankly out the window, a single thought consumed him. If this was about what he couldn't give her, would she ever stop? Or had her needs always been something no single man could satisfy? The following week passed in a fog for Mark. Karen carried on as though nothing had changed, her laughter filling the house like a haunting melody. Mark, meanwhile, kept up appearances, biding his time as he worked through the layers of betrayal and humiliation. Every smile she gave him now felt like a mockery of the love he had believed in. One evening, Mark finally worked up the courage to call the investigator again. "I need to know everything," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Not just a who and where, I need to know why. Why did she do this?" The investigator hesitated. "Mark, sometimes you don't want the answers to questions like that." "I need to know," Mark insisted. After a long pause, the investigator sighed. "I'll keep digging." A few days later, the investigator called back with a chilling update. "It's not just Daniel," he said. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his throat tightening. "I found evidence that she's had other relationships over the years. Not as consistent as Daniel, but there were others. Some brief, some lasting a few months." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "How many?" he managed to choke out. "At least 3, maybe 4. The investigator replied. "It seems Daniel has been the longest, but he wasn't the first. From what I can piece together, this started about 15 years ago. 15 years. That was 2 years into their marriage. Mark thought back to those early days, the small cracks that had seemed insignificant at the time. The nights when Karen had been too tired. Or the sudden shifts in her mood. He had chalked it up to stress, to the natural ebbs and flows of a relationship. But now, it seemed those cracks had been warning signs of a fracture he had been too blind to see. Later that night, as Karen sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, Mark sat beside her, watching her face. She looked so calm, so content. He felt a surge of anger rise in him but forced it down. He couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed to hear it from her lips, to understand the truth behind all of this. "Karen," he said softly, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within him. "Do you ever feel like we've changed over the years? Like maybe we've lost something?" She looked up at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "I just feel like maybe we haven't been as connected as we used to be. Do you ever feel that way?" Karen hesitated, her eyes searching his. "I think all marriages go through phases," she said carefully. "We've been together a long time, Mark. It's normal to feel like things ebb and flow." Her answer was measured, guarded. Mark knew better than to push further. Instead, he leaned back, forcing a smile. "Yeah, you're probably right." But her response only confirmed what he already suspected. Karen had perfected the art of deflection. She wasn't going to admit anything unless she was cornered. That night, Mark lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the years they had spent building a life together, the shared laughter, the milestones, the quiet evenings where nothing seemed wrong. And he thought about the photos, the texts, the trips she had taken under the guise of work. All of it painted a picture of a woman who had always been searching for something more, something he couldn't give her. Mark's mind kept returning to an unspoken truth that now seemed impossible to ignore. Karen had once described him as safe, a word she had meant as a compliment. But now, it felt like an indictment, a confirmation that he had never been the man who could truly satisfy her needs, no matter how hard he tried. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was all around him. Karen wasn't just cheating. She was running from something, or towards something, that he would never fully understand. And as much as it hurt, Mark began to realize that the woman he had loved for 17 years had been a stranger all along. Mark spent the next few days grappling with the weight of his discoveries. The truth was heavier than he could bear, yet he carried it silently, unwilling to confront Karen until he had all the pieces. His pride, his sense of self-worth, his belief in their life together, all of it hung by a thread. And beneath it all, a deeper question gnawed at him: had he ever truly known the woman he married? Karen's behavior began to shift. Whether it was guilt or suspicion, Mark couldn't be sure, but she seemed more attentive. She asked about his day more often, offered to cook dinner, a rarity in their marriage, and even suggested they plan a getaway together. At any other time, Mark might have welcomed these gestures. Now, they felt like breadcrumbs, thrown to a starving man in the hopes he wouldn't notice the feast stolen from him. One evening, Mark decided to look deeper into their past. He retrieved an old photo album from the attic, flipping through the pages of their early years. Their wedding day smiled back at him, Karen radiant in her gown, Mark beaming with a naive confidence. But as he turned the pages, he noticed something that sent a chill through him. In a photo from their second anniversary, Karen stood beside him at a restaurant, her arm looped through his. Her smile was there, but her eyes were distant. Even back then, had she been elsewhere in her mind? His heart ached at the thought. He had loved her so deeply, so completely, yet it seemed that love had always been a one-sided devotion. Mark's gaze lingered on the photo until he noticed the edge of a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. He pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. It was a note, written in Karen's unmistakable handwriting. "Sometimes I feel trapped, like I'm living someone else's life. But I tell myself it's enough. It has to be enough." Mark's breath hitched. The note wasn't addressed to anyone, and there was no date, but its meaning was clear. Karen had been struggling with their marriage long before he had ever suspected. As he sat there, the pieces began to fall into place. Karen hadn't just fallen into Daniel's arms out of passion or recklessness. She had been searching for a way to fill a void she had felt for years, a void Mark now realized he was powerless to fill. The realization sent him spiraling. He thought of all the times she had pulled away from him, all the subtle signs he had ignored because he couldn't face the possibility that he might not be enough for her. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about the life they had built together, and whether it had ever been real for her. Mark decided he needed to confront Karen soon, but he wanted to do it on his terms. He reached out to the investigator one last time, asking for the full dossier on her movements and relationships over the years. If he was going to have this conversation, he needed to be armed with the truth. When the report arrived, Mark read it with a heavy heart. Karen's relationship with Daniel had been more than just an affair, it had been a second life. They had shared anniversaries, weekends away, even private traditions that mirrored the ones she and Mark had once celebrated. And yet, amidst all the details, there was one that struck him like a thunderbolt. A single line in the report read, "Daniel's recent financial troubles appear to have strained their relationship. Sources suggest that Karen has been funding some of their trips." Karen had been using their shared money to sustain her double life. The betrayal was so profound that Mark felt physically ill. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about deception at the most fundamental level. And now, as he sat alone in their quiet home, Mark knew the time for waiting was over. He needed to confront Karen, not just to understand why she had done this, but to decide what was left of the life they had built together. Mark rehearsed what he would say 100 times, pacing the kitchen as the words tumbled in his head. He wanted to approach the conversation with calm, to resist the urge to lash out. But every time he thought about the lies, the money, and the years of deceit, his anger simmered just beneath the surface. That evening, Karen came home later than usual. She breezed into the house, her purse slung over her shoulder and her usual cheerful smile plastered on her face. "Hey, honey," she said casually, hanging up her coat. "Sorry I'm late, work ran over." Mark watched her for a moment, his jaw tight. This was the woman who had shared his life, his home, his dreams. Yet she had also shared herself with another man, weaving a tapestry of lies so intricately that he had never seen the threads unraveling. "Karen, we need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. She hesitated, her smile faltering. "Sure. What's up? Sit down." He gestured to the dining table, where a folder rested, thick with the investigator's report, the photos, and the damning receipt he had found in her luggage. Karen's eyes flicked to the folder, a flicker of something, fear, crossing her face. She sat, folding her hands in front of her. "You're scaring me, Mark. What's this about?" Mark sat across from her, sliding the folder toward her. "This is about us. About what you've been hiding from me for the past 17 years. Karen's face went pale, her hands trembling as she opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the contents, the photos, the texts, the receipts, and her expression shifted from confusion to panic. "Mark, she began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't lie to me, Karen. Not anymore. I know about Daniel. I know about the trips, the money, the lies. I know about everything." Karen's lips parted, but no words came. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if summoning the strength to speak. "I never wanted you to find out like this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what you have to say." Mark's voice rose, the anger he had tried to suppress bubbling to the surface. "You never wanted me to find out? After all these years of lies, of pretending? Do you even realize what you've done to me? To us?" Karen looked down at her hands, tears pooling in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," she said, her voice cracking. I tried, Mark. I really tried to make this work. But what?" he demanded. "What was so wrong with us that you had to turn to someone else? What was I missing?" Karen hesitated, and in that moment, Mark felt the weight of her silence. She wasn't just searching for words. She was searching for a way to soften the blow. "It's not you, Mark," she said finally, her voice trembling. "It's me. I needed something more, something you couldn't give me." Mark's heart twisted. "Something I couldn't give you? What does that even mean, Karen? I gave you everything. My love, my trust, my life. And it wasn't enough for you?" Tears streamed down her face now. "I know how this sounds, and I hate myself for it. But there were things I needed, things I couldn't ask you for because I knew it would hurt you. And I didn't want to hurt you." Mark leaned back in his chair, stunned. "You didn't want to hurt me? Karen, you've been hurting me for 17 years. I just didn't know it until now." The room fell silent, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them both. Karen wiped her tears, looking at him with an expression that was part sorrow, part desperation. "I know I can't take back what I've done," she said softly. "But I need you to understand, this was never about not loving you. I do love you, Mark. I always have." Mark shook his head, his voice hollow. "You don't destroy the people you love, Karen. You don't spend 17 years lying to them, using them, betraying them." He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need time to think," he said, walking toward the door. "Don't wait up for me." As he left the house, Karen's sobs echoed behind him. For the first time in 17 years, Mark didn't feel like the dependable man who always tried to fix things. He felt broken, adrift in a sea of betrayal with no shore in sight. Goodbye, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, the sequel.